So as you all know, horror movies tend to have a sort of outline to them. The slasher subgenre is no stranger to this, and maybe the originator of this idea of an outline. It solidified its existence with movies like Halloween and Black Christmas. Halloween blew it into the atmosphere with its ability to make Jamie Lee Curtis a star, and the way it pushed slasher movies into the spotlight really showed how that outline was enjoyable, and most importantly for companies and movie producers all across the world, easy and affordable to create. The outline of the slasher film is someone kills some kids and then there's a final girl, as well as what happens when you drink, do drugs, or have relations with someone. So let's get into the outline that defines the slasher genre. The opening kill is definitely the first step in any horror movie. The opening kill defines how the movie will go, the tone of its kills, how gory or not gory the movie will be, what kind of weapon would be used, and how the kills will be shot during most of the movie. There are various cases for this throughout slasher films. A prominent example of this that is most closely associated with slashers is Halloween 1978. The setting of the two teens having relations, then Michael walking into his sister's room and repeatedly stabbing his sister to death. Afterwards, he walks out, he goes outside. What's important is this entire time it was Michael's POV. So you actually didn't know this, but when he walks back outside, a car pulls up and a couple steps out of the car. They're older-ish. The dad unmasks us, or Michael, which breaks the point of view, and it turns out that first off, it's Michael, and second off, Michael as a little boy. This was definitely a shock for audiences with the twist being done the way it was. It solidified itself as a surefire way to start a slasher film. The opening kill is one of the most iconic parts of any horror movies because of the precedent that it sets, and the fact that it gives a slight plot jump into what we should be expecting for the rest of the movie in terms of plot advancement. In the first 10 minutes, you can usually tell where the rest of the film is going based on that one opening kill. The title card with theme music is a staple of any horror movie. A flashy title card makes anyone who's watching understand exactly what kind of movie they're getting themselves into. Halloween and Friday the 13th are prominent examples of flashy title cards that work for the movie that it is in. These are some of the most famous title cards and the most parodied title cards in all of horror history. We'll start with perhaps the most iconic of the two, Halloween. This title card is not only a title, but also includes the pumpkin. The pumpkin is basically a part of the title card until the very end, when we see Michael Myers' face and a knife with the title card, John Carpenter's Halloween, which then proceeds to fade to black. And if you're like me, the entire movie just started playing, just based on that one iconic title card. The reason this title card is so iconic is for a few reasons. First off, the music that's playing during this title card and then plays throughout other key moments in the film. So during rewatches, you feel the importance and the iconicness of the score that you're listening to. The next incredibly iconic title card is Friday the 13th. This title card is different from Halloween as it's literally a title card smash onto the screen. The title card, which is simply Friday the 13th, smashes into the screen, breaking the glass of the screen. That paired with the swirling iconic theme that plays and brings us into the credits definitely makes this title card as iconic as any other, and plays a heavy hand in other movies' title cards and themes. Now, let's move from the title card into another step in how to make a slasher film. The time jump isn't as common as tropes previously mentioned. It happens especially in movies that are not sequels or are first in a series. These usually happen for the sake of plot and aren't usually in every slasher movie. In fact, a very common staple of slasher films is that there isn't a time jump in that the film takes place directly after its predecessor in that line of films. Not necessarily the first, but the most common example when you combine the idea of slasher film and time jump is Halloween. In the opening kill, you have Michael Myers as a child, and 15 years later, you have him escaping from Smith Grove Sanitarium, driving away in a car. I'm not the only one to ever say this, but how exactly does a kid that grew up in a sanitarium and then 15 years later he knows how to drive a car? But that's just kind of whatever. That's, I guess, a plot hole, kind of, but not really. It doesn't really matter all that much. The entire point of this is the fact that they never really talk about Michael as being an adult. They always talk about him as a kid that is purely evil. They never mention him as an adult in the original Halloween. That is why it is so important for the time jump to happen the way it did, is because it makes Michael more mysterious. One of the examples of the opposite of a time jump is actually in this franchise with Halloween 2, where it takes place the same night and right after the events of the original Halloween. Laurie Strode is in the hospital where the entire movie takes place. In Halloween 2, instead of just placing the ending of the original onto the beginning of the second film, they decided to reshoot everything, which in my opinion shows that they actually cared about what they were doing. It's hard to understand exactly why they would have thought that putting the original ending at the beginning of the second film would have been worth it, unless it was just too expensive or whatever that may be. So now let's just move on to the next step in how to make a slasher film. So this is the part of slasher movies where we are introduced to the main characters that we will be following for the remainder of the film. This is super common in movies like Friday the 13th, where it happens right after the time jump or right after the connection to the original, depending on whether or not it is a sequel. For example, in the original Friday the 13th, because the character we meet in the opening right after the opening kill is looking to go to Camp Blood or Camp Crystal Lake. She's looking to get there because she's a camp counselor there for the summer. Eventually, they make their way to the camp, and that's when we are introduced to the other main characters. They have been there for quite a while beforehand. When she actually gets there, they are working with some logs. When the counselor got there that was looking for Camp Crystal Lake, she was told to go painting. During this and the surrounding scenes before any of the characters are killed, there are many moments and shots that just kind of establish the kinds of characters that these people are. Okay, so I'll go a little bit more into depth in this next one. This would be the original Halloween 1978. First, we are introduced to Laurie Strode, who has to go to the Myers house to drop off a key. On her way there, Tommy Walsh shows up and they have a short conversation, presuming that Laurie has babysat Tommy before. Later on, there's the famous scene of the three girls walking down the street. I can't talk about all the banter that they have here and stay somewhat streamlined, but in terms of character development, it makes most horror movies look like they were written by 10-year-olds. And I want to shout out here Deborah Hill, who wrote the dialogue for these three girls. Most people, think of John Carpenter when they think of Halloween, but Deborah Hill wrote the dialogue for the three girls, and without those scenes, Halloween would be completely different. Anyways, the character development that you see kind of shows how they react to the rest of the film that takes place, which I won't get into right now. It really does make sense how they react and communicate to each other based on what happens. This kind of overlaps with my previous topic, but Scream is a perfect example for both the introduction of the main characters and the opening kill. The opening kill is where Drew Barrymore as Casey Becker is killed by Ghostface, which is probably one of the most famous opening kills in any horror movie. Right after the opening kill, we cut straight to Sidney Prescott on her very 90s looking computer. I think part of what makes Scream work so well is kind of just being thrown into everything is what makes that movie work. These characters have existed before you, and these characters will exist after you unless you watch them die. And that is why Scream works as well as it does. The next part of this video is the one that is the most stereotypical when it comes to slasher films. This is one stereotype that is the difference between a slasher film trying to be different and one that is just trying to imitate all of the others. Let's look at it this way. Every single Friday the 13th film starts with counselors having relations and doing drugs, while others that are trying to casually change the genre don't have those things in such a prevalent way. The best way to make a slasher film stand out is to exclude those things unless they're important to the plot, because making them important to the plot is also a twist on this stereotype. That would be different than most slasher films where they do drugs and have sex just to get people into the theater. I think producers of slasher films are starting to realize that we won't go to a movie just because those things are in it. I think we can all see everything we want to online, and I think that is fundamentally changing the slasher genre. The way that we watch horror movies has changed a lot since the slasher boom in the 1980s. We care much more about tension and the kills than we do about anything else. Movies that tend to cater more towards just making as much money as they possibly can will have characters with lackluster personalities, when they would make more money if they tried to convince us that the characters we're watching are actually rooted in reality, which would help us connect to these characters. The best example of this is Friday the 13th or Halloween. Halloween focuses less on drugs and more on people having sex, which is a big part of the movie. Halloween features teenagers, probably in their late high school years, and they often are having sex because, of course, this is a slasher film. But however, in that film, it feels genuine. Like, the plot revolves or kind of around the fact that the characters around Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode are kind of just being ignorant of the events of Michael Myers' slayings around Haddonfield. For whatever reasons, drugs and sex are written into slasher films so often, the fact that it's a staple and pinnacle of most slasher films is undeniable. The first kill post the opening kill in a slasher movie is the most important and tone-setting in the entire film. It shows how our slasher will kill its victims, how long or drawn out all the kills will be, and how the film will set up the tension beforehand. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an amazing example of this. This movie has a completely different tone than the rest. There is no opening kill and there is no time jump either. The first kill that does happen in this movie, however, is what makes this movie so memorable. We have a group of probably college-age kids driving through Texas to get to their grandparents' abandoned house. They find a farmhouse and get into it and try to see if someone can help them get gas for their car. The one member of the crew walks into the house, yells to try to get someone's attention, and as he's walking further into the house, he trips into the kitchen and gets beaten over the head with a mallet. He shudders, flails on the floor, and gets hit again. Leatherface pulls the body into the room and shuts the door behind him. Watching this for the first time without knowing this scene was coming up, the most terrified I'd ever been during a slasher film. It is so out of nowhere. The tension is kind of there, but not enough for you to know that something is about to happen. And then after that scene, every single beat and moment of that film is filled with tension. The slasher movie often tries its hardest to put the most emphasis on that opening kill. The way they do that often depends if and how the movie will be during its opening kills. Some movies opt to be bloody and graphic, others try to be more subtle, going for the less is more approach. The way these kills are written or shot often make or break the whole film. Horror movies that become iconic have high tension, well shot kills. This is one of the most stereotypical things to happen in almost any horror movie. A group of teenagers splits apart into groups of 2 or 3. After that, a masked killer kills all of them one by one. I know I've been talking about these two movies a lot, but listen to what happens in movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Scream. The teenagers most of the time end up splitting up one way or the other. Sometimes it's on purpose, sometimes it just happens. But when the teenagers split up, that's how you know someone is about to die. If you pay attention to when the teenagers split up, you may be able to tell who's going to die and who is going to get away. For an example, I'm going to the crown jewel of slasher films, Halloween. In Halloween, the teenagers are together walking down the sidewalk in the beginning of the film. In fact, they actually encounter Michael Myers when they're all together, but no harm is done. But when they split up later in the film, that's when you can see that splitting up is actually what caused all of their downfalls. If you watch a movie like Scream, for example, which I would do if you're trying to study the slasher film for a script you're writing or just anything, which I would do if you're trying to study the slasher film as a subgenre. You'll see how they specifically point out when they're going away or if they're with their friends. This is specifically because big name slasher film sets the precedent of the main beats of every slasher film that tries to repeat or copy the success of that slasher film. Horror movies copying each other is a massive issue that happens a lot. You tend to see remakes happening one after the other. You see slasher films in big pushes. You see paranormal films all in big pushes. But anyways, the teens will decide that the best course of action is to go their separate ways. And with that, their fate of getting stabbed, chopped, burnt, or thrown off a bridge, or otherwise killed, is set in stone. This is the part where horror movies and slasher films will tend to kind of vary from each other, but will often share some of the same ideas and some of the other kind of beats. One beat more often than not is that someone will do an illegal or immoral act and then have sex and then die. In Halloween, yeah, I reference Halloween a lot, but of course I do in this video. When two of our characters are supposed to be babysitting kids, one of them goes to have sex with her boyfriend in one of the kids' parents' house. This would be considered immoral, and they end up paying the price by being killed by Michael Myers in that house. Which also goes back to my previous point of splitting up and you end up dying. This always happens in movies like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The next little variant in slasher films is a twist ending. This doesn't happen in many slasher films, but the ones that there are a twist ending are really cool. I'm not going to spoil the ending of the film for you if you have no clue what I'm talking about, but Sleepaway Camp has a twist ending, which I think is a good ending. It kind of makes you rethink the movie and what the movie is trying to portray to you. In some other slashers, however, this is the part towards the end when slashers tend to try to set up its sequel. These are more prominent in movies where they're kind of in the middle of a bunch of sequels like Halloween or Friday the 13th. So these are the beats, the plots of slasher films. All of these beats, plots can be interpreted, they can be copied, they can be twisted on, you can do whatever you want with these, but this is how to write a slasher film. You can stay up to date with me and all the things that I do by going to @MediaByteCo on TikTok and @MediaByteCompany on Instagram. Patreon is for commentaries, and make sure you like, subscribe, comment, do all that fun stuff for me. I would really appreciate that. Thank you all for all that you guys do for me, watching, listening, subscribing, all that stuff. It really does mean everything to me. The biggest channel I've ever had, and 10 years of making YouTube videos. So thank you. I really do deeply appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.